Imagine a general winning a major battle. He stands on a very muddy field. He claims a glorious victory for Britain. But he looks around the silent ground. A quarter of his elite army lies dead. His best officers are bleeding in the dirt. This was March 15th in 1781. The British army had just won the fight. Yet this victory destroyed their entire American empire. How can winning a battle lose a war? The answer lies deep in a Carolina forest. It involves the most deadly tactical trap ever. An American general built a massive meat grinder. He forced the British to march right inside. They were chewed up over 90 brutal minutes. The British never recovered from this terrible day. This is the story of Guilford Courthouse. It is a masterclass in brutal military strategy. You need to hear this unbelievable historical story. The American Revolution was hanging by a thread. Everything depended on this single, desperate, bloody clash. British commanders thought they had crushed the rebellion. They chased the Americans across the entire South. They burned their own supplies to move faster. They wanted to finish the war that morning. But they walked straight into a brilliant nightmare. The trap was designed to bleed them dry. It worked better than anyone could ever imagine. The American cause in the South was dying. British forces controlled almost every major port city. They had captured Charleston in a devastating blow. Lord Cornwallis marched his army inland with confidence. His elite redcoats were crushing all rebel resistance. Local loyalist militias were terrorizing the terrified patriots everywhere. The Continental Army seemed completely broken and defeated. America needed a massive miracle to save the revolution. General George Washington knew the situation was desperate. He sent his most trusted general down south. Nathanael Greene arrived to find a starving army. The men had no shoes and no supplies. Greene looked at his fragile, broken fighting force. He knew a direct fight meant absolute slaughter. Cornwallis wanted a massive battle to finish things quickly. The British general was an aggressive, ruthless commander. He wanted to crush Greene into the dirt. But Greene refused to give him that fight. Instead, the American general started a wild retreat. This retreat would become incredibly famous in history. Greene began running north toward the Dan River. He pulled the angry British army behind him. He was stretching their supply lines extremely thin. Cornwallis was blinded by his aggressive fighting spirit. He chased the Americans deeper into the wilderness. He did not realize he was being hunted. This deadly chase set the stage for total destruction. Nathanael Greene was not a typical military general. He grew up as a peaceful Quaker boy. He taught himself how to fight using books. Other officers mocked his lack of formal training. But Greene had a brilliantly sharp tactical mind. He understood exactly how his broken army functioned. He knew militia units would run under pressure. He refused to expect impossible bravery from farmers. Greene studied a recent American victory called Cowpens. Daniel Morgan had crushed the British right there. Morgan used retreating militia as a clever bait. Greene decided to steal this brilliant tactical trap. He wanted to make the trap much bigger. He needed the absolute perfect ground to fight. He remembered a small clearing deep in Carolina. It was a place called the Guilford Courthouse. The terrain was a terrifying nightmare for attackers. Thick woods surrounded a narrow and muddy road. Greene knew the British loved open field battles. He would deny them that clean, open fight. He planned to drag them through thick mud. He would make them bleed for every inch. The aggressive British general would never stop attacking. Greene counted on this blind enemy aggression completely. The architect of death was finalizing his blueprint. The bloody trap was finally ready to spring. Pay attention to his next brilliant strategic move. It explains how America actually won the war. The race to the Dan River had begun. Greene pushed his starving army to the limit. They marched through freezing rain and terrible mud. Bloody footprints marked their desperate trail every day. Cornwallis was always just one step behind them. The British army marched faster than anyone expected. They abandoned their sleep to catch the Americans. It was a brutal game of cat and mouse. Greene needed to cross the deep, freezing river. If he failed, his entire army would die. American engineers secretly gathered boats along the riverbanks. The British vanguard finally reached the water's edge. They thought they had trapped the rebel force, but they only saw empty water and silence. The Americans had crossed just hours before them. Cornwallis stared across the cold and empty water. He had chased a ghost across the Carolinas. His elite soldiers were completely exhausted and starving. They were hundreds of miles from their base. Greene had survived this impossible and deadly race. Now he rested his men on safe ground. New reinforcements poured into his camp every day. Greene was finally ready to turn around and fight. Cornwallis was about to make a fatal mistake. He would let his blind anger rule him. This choice would doom the entire British Empire. The hunter was about to become the hunted. Lord Cornwallis was completely consumed by his furious rage. He wanted to catch Greene at any possible cost. His heavy supply wagons slowed his large army down. The British general made an absolutely insane tactical decision. He ordered his men to burn their vital supplies. Extra food and warm tents were thrown into fires. Even the precious rum rations were completely and utterly destroyed. The elite British army was now traveling extremely light. But this desperate choice came with a terrible price. His loyal soldiers were now marching without enough food. They slept in freezing mud without proper warm blankets. Cornwallis sacrificed his army just to catch a ghost. This angry decision is where the British lost everything. Greene watched this madness from across the dark river. He knew the British were starving and totally exhausted. The American general saw his brilliant trap taking shape. A hungry enemy makes incredibly stupid tactical combat mistakes. Cornwallis was walking blindly into a massive killing zone. The British soldiers pushed forward through the dark woods. They had no idea what was waiting for them ahead. The stage was set for a truly brutal slaughter. Pay close attention to what happened the very next morning. The bloodiest trap in American history was finally waiting. No one could prepare for this massive, brutal carnage. The elite redcoats would soon face absolute, total hell. This desperate pursuit sealed their dark and violent fate. Greene finally crossed back over the dark river. His massive trap needed the absolute perfect battlefield. He marched his army to the Guilford Courthouse. This terrain was a nightmare for British soldiers. Thick, dark forests covered the entire muddy landscape. The British army relied on clean, open battlefields. They needed open space to march in formation. Greene wanted to break their neat fighting lines. He forced them to fight in the woods. The muddy road acted like a natural funnel. It pulled the British right into the trap. Dense trees blocked their views of the enemy. British artillery could not shoot through thick timber. Greene controlled exactly where the enemy would step. Cornwallis marched his starving men toward the courthouse. He saw the thick trees and muddy fields. A smarter general would have stopped right there. He would have retreated to fight another day. But Cornwallis was blinded by his own anger. He ordered his tired men to march forward. The redcoats walked right into the deadly funnel. They had no idea what hid waiting ahead. The American general smiled as the trap closed. This brilliant terrain choice changed the entire war. Now you will see how the trap snapped. The massive killing machine was fully powered up. Nathanael Greene built his trap with 3 layers. Each layer was deadlier than the last one. He arranged his massive army in 3 lines. These lines were set deep inside the forest. The first line was North Carolina local militia. They waited nervously behind a long wooden fence. The second line hid deep in the woods. These were hardened Virginia riflemen waiting in silence. The third line held the absolute high ground. These were his best-trained Continental regular soldiers. They were the heavy anvil of the trap. Greene rode his horse down the entire line. He spoke quietly to his terrified militiamen. He asked them for only 2 simple shots. Just fire 2 shots and walk away safely. The plan was absolutely brilliant in its simplicity. The British would break through the first line. They would think they were winning the battle. But the woods would shatter their tight formations. Then the Virginia riflemen would completely slaughter them. Finally, the exhausted survivors would hit the regulars. This was a pure masterpiece of military strategy. Greene was leading the British into total hell. This master plan was about to be tested. The British drums began beating in the distance. The bloody meat grinder was ready to start. The British army marched out of the trees. They formed perfectly straight lines in the mud. Elite redcoats advanced toward the wooden rail fence. North Carolina militia watched them with shaking hands. The American farmers rested rifles on the wood. They waited until the British were extremely close. A single order echoed across the quiet field. The entire fence line erupted in violent smoke. Hundreds of British soldiers fell into the mud. It was a completely devastating wall of lead. The elite redcoats stepped over their dead friends. They leveled their sharp bayonets and charged forward. British soldiers screamed as they rushed the fence. The scared American militia fired one more time. Then they turned around and ran away fast. They had done their simple but deadly job. The British army cheered at the retreating Americans. They thought this battle was already over now. Cornwallis ordered his men to chase them down. This was the exact mistake Greene wanted perfectly. The redcoats charged directly into the dark forest. They were chasing the bait into the trap. They had no idea what waited inside there. The real nightmare was only just beginning now. The first layer of hell was now breached. The British victory cheers would soon become screams. Pay close attention to this next brilliant phase. The British soldiers rushed into the dark woods. Their perfect straight lines immediately broke apart completely. Thick trees and bushes ruined their tight formations. The Virginia riflemen were hiding behind giant oak trees. These men were hardened and ruthless frontier hunters. They aimed their long rifles at the confused redcoats. Deadly sniper fire rained down from every single direction. British officers were shot straight off their massive horses. The thick smoke made it impossible to see anything. Elite British soldiers were completely lost in the woods. It turned into a savage and bloody guerrilla fight. Men fought hand to hand behind the thick trees. The British bayonets were useless in this dense brush. Virginia riflemen shot them down like trapped wild animals. Cornwallis watched his proud army slowly disappear inside. The forest floor was covered in rich British blood. Greene's massive trap was chewing up the enemy slowly. The redcoats pushed forward through sheer desperate bravery alone. They suffered horrific casualties for every single muddy step. But the worst part of the trap was waiting. The bleeding survivors were about to face true hell. This was exactly what the American general planned perfectly. The American masterpiece was working flawlessly in the shadows. A brutal nightmare was waiting right around the corner. Pay very close attention to this massive upcoming clash. The dark forest became a massive bloody meat grinder. British soldiers lost all their organized military unit cohesion. Redcoats fought desperate battles against hidden American frontier snipers. Men were brutally stabbed behind giant thick oak trees. The loud noise of musket fire was completely deafening. Exhausted British soldiers crawled through the terrible thick mud. Elite commanders could not see their own fighting men. American riflemen fired and faded away like silent ghosts. The British army was bleeding out in the shadows. Cornwallis sent his best backup units into the woods. These fresh soldiers also vanished into the smoky chaos. Greene watched his brilliant plan working absolutely perfectly today. The second defensive line was destroying the British advance. Every single inch of ground cost massive British casualties. But the fierce redcoats refused to give up completely. They pushed through the deadly woods with pure rage. Their bright red uniforms were covered in dark blood. They finally saw the clear edge of the woods. The surviving soldiers stumbled out of the dark trees. They thought the terrible nightmare was finally over now. They were completely wrong about their bloody dark fate. The final layer of hell was waiting right ahead. This next brutal clash would change history forever now. Watch closely as the ultimate deadly trap finally closes. The bleeding British soldiers stumbled into an open field. They looked up at the high, muddy hill ahead. The final American line waited there in perfect silence. These were the hardened Continental regular soldiers of America. They were fully trained to fight like European professionals. Nathanael Greene placed his best men on this hill. The exhausted redcoats gasped for air in the mud. American regular soldiers aimed their loaded muskets right down. A massive deadly volley ripped through the British ranks. Hundreds of lead balls smashed into the tired redcoats. The British line completely buckled under this heavy fire. But the elite British Guards refused to stay down. They fixed their sharp bayonets and charged uphill screaming. The Continental soldiers stood their ground without any fear. They charged downhill to meet the British head-on. The two armies crashed together with brutal, terrible force. The heavy anvil of the trap was finally struck. Men fought wildly with knives and broken wooden muskets. The open field turned into a giant, bloody brawl. General Cornwallis watched his entire army collapsing in front. He was about to make a truly unthinkable decision. This desperate order would shock military historians forever now. Pay attention to this next completely insane historical moment. The hand-to-hand combat was absolutely terrifying. American and British soldiers fought like wild animals. Sharp steel bayonets pierced through flesh and bone. The muddy field became a slippery, bloody mess. Elite British Guards clashed with brave American regulars. No one would back down from this massive fight. The heavy smoke blinded everyone on the battlefield. Screams of dying men echoed across the hills. General Greene watched his trap working perfectly today. He had crushed the proud British military machine. The British commander saw his army failing fast. Cornwallis faced the complete destruction of his force. He needed a desperate miracle to survive this. American soldiers started pushing the redcoats back down. The entire British line was about to shatter. They were losing the biggest brawl of the war. A brilliant trap was claiming its final victims. The survival of the American Revolution hung here. Cornwallis prepared to cross a very dark line. He rode his horse toward his massive cannons. This next choice haunts his dark legacy forever. You will not believe what he ordered next. His own men were about to pay dearly. The unthinkable friendly fire was about to start. History remembers this moment with absolute pure horror. The trapped redcoats fought for their very lives. The deadly American anvil was crushing them completely. Cornwallis watched his elite guards dying in the mud. The American regulars were winning this massive bloody brawl. The desperate British general made a truly shocking decision. He rode his tall horse directly toward his cannons. He ordered the artillerymen to load massive grape shot immediately. Grape shot acts like a giant deadly shotgun blasting out. His officers begged him not to fire the cannons. British soldiers were still fighting inside that exact spot. Firing into the massive crowd meant killing his men. Cornwallis ignored their pleas and ordered the immediate fire. Massive cannons erupted with a truly deafening explosive roar. Hundreds of heavy iron balls ripped through the crowd. The deadly blast tore American and British bodies apart. It was an absolute massacre of his own soldiers. This brutal friendly fire stopped the heavy American advance. But the sheer cost in blood was completely horrifying. The loud screams of his own men echoed everywhere. Cornwallis had saved his army by murdering his soldiers. This ruthless order shows the pure desperation of war. General Greene saw the brutal carnage from the hill. He knew it was time for his next move. His brilliant trap had already done its bloody job. Pay attention to how Greene finished this master plan. Nathanael Greene evaluated the bloody battlefield with calm eyes. His brilliant trap had worked absolutely perfectly today. The British army was completely shattered and bleeding out. Cornwallis had lost a quarter of his best men. Greene could have ordered one final massive, desperate charge. But a smart general never destroys his own army. The American commander ordered a highly disciplined tactical retreat. The Continental soldiers pulled back in perfectly organized lines. They left the muddy field to the exhausted British. Cornwallis stood alone among hundreds of dead, bloody bodies. He technically won the battle by holding the ground. But holding this empty dirt meant absolutely nothing now. His supply lines were gone, and his men starved. Greene saved his entire army to fight another day. The Americans marched away with their heads held high. They had just crippled the mighty British Empire forever. The bloody meat grinder had done its terrible job. Cornwallis realized he had walked into a fatal trap. This hollow victory was essentially a massive strategic defeat. The final nail in the British coffin was approaching. The road to total ruin was now wide open. You must hear how this disaster finally ended everything. The final chapter reveals the ultimate fate of Britain.